Welcome, discipleship class. So, we are beginning a new presentation tonight, and this one is going to be on the New Testament. So, again, the foundation for the whole thing really is I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and then I've taken basically Dr. Norman Geisler's presentation and blended it really with the best of what Frank Turek has, and so it's a conglomeration trying to simplify things and give you the best information. So here we go. We've gone through the first 3 points, actually 4, and then we're jumping into number 6 now. We did 4 and 5 together last time. If God exists, then miracles are possible. Miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. So now, the question is, the New Testament, is it reliable? So we're going to go through, these are the rest of the points. It's a logical building. So tonight we'll begin the New Testament, and this information is going to take us more than one time. So what we need to understand, though, we will walk through each of the points. Points 7 to 12 follow as a natural result of New Testament reliability. That's why this is so important, this presentation in particular. And if the New Testament is reliable, it substantiates the reliability of the Old Testament. But we will walk through all of those together. But 2 questions have to be answered. So, first of all, do we have an accurate copy of New Testament documents? This can easily be verified by what we call transmission, which is how the manuscripts were copied and geographically distributed over time. And so we'll go through that evidence. And then secondly, do the New Testament documents tell the truth? Now, you can have documents that are accurately transmitted. In other words, they copied them successfully, but they don't tell the truth. So we have to be able to substantiate that too. So we can have accurate copies of lies, the Quran, the Book of Mormon. I mean, if they have accurate copies, they obviously do not tell the truth. And then the historicity, which is the historical accuracy of the New Testament documents, have to be examined, just like any other historical document, to verify its authenticity and its accuracy to actual historical events. So, transmission. New Testament documents are not transmitted by the telephone game. The New Testament was not told to one person who told another, and so on. Usually that's what you get off of some publications that, they play the telephone game and they pass the information around the room. By the time you get to the end, you realize, well, it's not even close to what it started with. And so, hey, how can you have anything close to what we started with the New Testament writers? Well, this is the idea of the telephone game. It starts out good on the left, and then by the time it gets to the right, it's all deteriorated and you don't know what it is. But from I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, there's a quote that says, numerous people independently witnessed New Testament events. Many of them committed it to memory, and 9 of those eyewitnesses, or contemporaries, put their observations in writing. So that's what we have in much of the New Testament. So here are some of the facts regarding transmission. Number 1, the New Testament documents are 27 different documents that were written on 27 different scrolls by 9 different writers over a 20 to 50 year period. Now, the reason that's important is because we have an idea that because it's all put together in the Bible today, that, it was all written down, at the same time, and somebody just kind of wrote through it and put them all together in one book. And that's really not what it is. We need to understand the New Testament is really 27 different documents. And then the New Testament is not one document, but 27 independent ones. There are 5,700, really, at this point, 5,800 copies of original language, which would be Greek, New Testament manuscripts, but no known originals exist today. So this is actually an advantage and not a liability. First of all, reconstructing originals is advantaged by the large numbers of documents from various geographies. It's important to understand that when you have an error, and we'll get into this, it actually helps you today looking back and discovering what geographical area a particular copy comes from. If the copies maintain certain similar errors, then they can actually trace it as to location, geographically, the time setting, and everything else. More and earlier manuscripts provide trustworthy testimony and enable a more accurate reconstruction. And the process of comparing the many copies and quotations allows extremely accurate reconstruction of the original, and errors help, they don't hurt. So if we had writings that we were trying to verify from somewhere during the Civil War, and then it started out by saying you all, and then we had some that said y'all. Well, we know kind of geographically where they would come from, south of the Mason-Dixon line. And though that's a similarity to the type of things that they deal with the New Testament, it's much more sophisticated in how they do their analysis. But again, we'll get into a lot of that as we move through this. So first of all, what is an error? We need to know what an error is, because the old adage, figures don't lie, but liars sure can figure, certainly comes to light when dealing with critics of the Bible. So errors are variant spellings, misspellings, punctuation differences, and grammatical changes. Every time, if you had 1,000 copies with a misspelling in it, that's 1,000 errors. That's how it's logged. So once you get into the number of copies, the thousands that exist, and you start having these variant spellings and punctuation, then the errors add up quickly. But that doesn't mean that we can't understand what's being said. For example, you would collect your earnings if you got something in the mail that said this: you have won $10 million. You know, though the O in you may have been corrupted, you know exactly what's being communicated. Well, how about if the U was corrupted, right? Or the W in the 1, or the E in the 10. You still know it's 10 million, unless you wanted to make it a ton of million. But if you had all 4 of these examples as copies, you would know exactly what it said. There would never be a question. And this is an example of what New Testament errors look like. They aren't as abundant, but they're calculated similarly. How are they counted? Like I said, if you had 2,000 manuscripts and they had a spelling error, it would be counted as 2,000 errors. Skeptics twist it when it comes to these, but unfortunately, a lot of Christians don't know that the way the errors are tallied are not like normal errors in like mathematical error, in the sense that it would be just wrong. So, number 3, how do errors help reconstruct the original? Errors enable the manuscripts to be traced to their original geographies for a great degree of accuracy. Like I said, the example of something like y'all or you all in the U.S. Cross-checking errors helps with accuracy, because you can the study of manuscripts actually presents a situation where they can trace a particular error, oftentimes back to an original geography, and then they can trace, how copies got to that location originally. Also with different dates. If they have a late manuscript and it has the same error as a very, very early manuscript, then you realize that the copying has really remained consistent through hundreds of years at certain points. Errors combined with the material the manuscripts are written on enable accurate dating and geography. So, earlier on, it depends on whether they're written on parchments or vellum or animal skins, and all that, along with whether they're capitalized or lowercase letters, all those tell us about location as well as time. So what percent of the New Testament we possess is in error? Here's a quote from Philip Schaff in his book, A Comparison of the Greek New Testament and English Version. He said that he had calculated, Philip Schaff calculated that of 150,000 variants known in his day, that's more today, only 400 changed the meaning of the passage, only 50 were of real significance, and not even one affected an article of faith or a precept of duty, which is not abundantly substantiated by other and undoubted passages or by the whole tenor of Scripture reading. So there's no errors that are going to tell us something different. You're not going to have a manuscript copy that says Jesus is not the Messiah, Jesus isn't God, Jesus isn't this, that he didn't raise from the dead. You're not going to have any of those type of errors. So when skeptics use the term errors to describe New Testament manuscripts, they're using the quantity of errors, or technically they call them variants, to shock people into thinking the text is unknowable and unreliable, but nothing could be further from the truth. Errors or variants in the manuscripts actually help follow lines of manuscript copying and distribution to different geographies, like we said. And the errors are like a chain of custody in legal evidence, or like postage marks as a piece of postage moves from location to location. You get something from overseas, has all the different stamps on it because it had to go through the different postal locations. So without these errors to follow, there would be no way to follow the distribution of manuscripts around Europe, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Judea. All right, so let's look at what some of these are. So here's a variant, right? And a description. Simple copying mistake resulting in a phrase that clearly doesn't make sense, typically easy to recognize and correct. The importance. In one manuscript, for example, Galatians 1:11 begins, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel. Clearly, the copyist was serious about the gospel. Either that or he accidentally copied a phrase 2 extra times and thus introduced an easily corrected variant into the text. How about a change in word order? Sometimes words are rearranged. Word order does not matter as much in Greek as in English. Changes in Greek word order do not affect the meaning or the translation of the text. Like Star Wars, of Yoda you must think, and make more sense it will. How about a change in spelling? Alternatively spelled words, typically easy to recognize and correct. These variants rarely affect the translation or the meaning. Most often, the spelling errors are simply spelling variations, similar to the difference between the American form of the word color and British form color. Even when actual spelling errors may have occurred, the meaning of the text hasn't changed. Even in English, misspellings don't change the meanings. You could still understand the meaning of a sentence even if every word happened to be misspelled. And that's the idea behind this. How about a substitution? That's a word or phrase changed to another word or phrase. Substitutions are sometimes accidental, sometimes intentional, but they rarely change the meaning of the text. For example, in some manuscripts, John 1:6 reads, "There came a man sent from God," while a few have, "There came a man sent from the Lord." A word has changed, but the meaning remains the same. That's pretty obvious. How about an omission? A word or phrase left out, usually accidental. One copyist, for example, accidentally left out the Greek word in John 3:16 that's translated, "He gave." In this particular instance, the copyist caught his own omission and corrected it, but sometimes copyists didn't catch their omissions, resulting in variance in the manuscripts. And again, you have all these to compare, so it's not like you won't know what should be in the verse. How about a harmonization, a change to make one text more similar to a nearby text or to a parallel passage in another book? In many manuscripts, for example, the Lord's Prayer in Luke's Gospel is expanded to sound more like the Lord's Prayer in Matthew's Gospel. The point of the prayer remains unchanged, and nothing is introduced that would change our beliefs about God or about His work or the world. Since copyists copy the four Gospels consecutively, it's not surprising that they sometimes adapted phrases from one Gospel to sound like a similar text in another. So that's why sometimes you have these variations.
Let's compare the New Testament to ancient classical manuscripts. Okay, let's begin with that. If I want to know what the text says, I've got to have some good copies because there are going to be variant readings. Let me begin with the bad news. We have so many Greek manuscripts in the neighborhood of 55, maybe more right now, maybe 5,800 Greek manuscripts. We have so many copies that there are just plain a lot of variant readings. There are a lot of variant readings. I'm going to surprise some of you when I say this. And this figure is old. But the last figure I saw a couple decades ago is about 200,000 variant readings in the New Testament text. 200,000 variant readings. So, 200,000. How are we ever going to get to the bottom of this? How are we ever going to find out what the text says? Well, there's a little epistemic thing here for you philosophers. You know how you can get? You know how we know there's 200,000 variant readings? Because you can count them. And when you can count them, you can work on them. See, when you can count them, counting them means you know where they are. How many of you have ever seen the red plastic New Testaments that are put out in Greek, that are the chief critical Greek text that you could study in any university? If you can study Greek, you can get this red plastic New Testament. How many of you know what I'm talking about? It's about this size. Some of you do. Does anybody know what is the bottom of every one of those pages? When you go open up these Greek New Testaments that Greek students study, whether you're in a private school, state university, wherever, when you're studying the Greek text, about half the page will be the Greek text, and there will be something at the bottom. There'll be a line. Below that line, on every page, there's something there. Does anybody know what that is? Those of you raise your hand, you know what's at the bottom page? It's called critical apparatus. Every major variant reading is listed at the bottom of the page. So if you know Greek, and you get to be really good at this, the bad news is that there's 200,000 variants. The good news is you can put your finger on them, you know what they say, and you can evaluate them. The 200,000 variations bothers nobody. Everybody knows they're there. They're usually not aware that there's that many. They bother nobody because you can compare texts, and the New Testament is very, very wealthy in texts. Let me give you some examples. If you have 10 copies or partial copies of ancient historical texts, like Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, if you have 10, you are doing well. You're doing well. If you have 20 There are only a very, very, very few classical texts with more than 20 copies. Homer's Iliad is an example. There are over 600 copies of Homer's Iliad. That's fantastic. So let's take the number one competitor to the New Testament. Okay? Number one competitor. Final score, let's make this an athletic context. Final score, 5,500 to 650. First of all, you say, well, for classical text, 650 is fantastic. But don't look now, you just got killed. Well, you say, well, come on, it's not that straight a deal. It's not like a numbers game, like a basketball game. No, really. Again, we can pursue this in the Q&A if you want to. But for the most part, more texts make a more accurate reading.
I love Gary Habermas. He's one of the best. So, if we go on, only 1 in 60 of the variants have significance. This would leave a text 98.33% pure. And, the quote I had put up earlier was from Philip Schaff, which was in the 1800s. And so there was 150,000. Now it's up to 200,000 variant readings, but they've also collected more texts. Now, by comparison with other ancient documents, the Mahabharata of Hinduism at about 90% accuracy, and Homer's Iliad about 95%, the New Testament is about 99.5% accurate. And Geisler's Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics goes into these in more detail if you're interested. Later manuscripts are not considered less valuable than earlier, since the errors can be traced to see the accuracy of copying over the centuries. So actually later manuscripts are very important. So when somebody says, well, that's a later manuscript, yes, it may be, but it also tells us if copying over the centuries had changed, or how can we know? Because again, we can follow the errors. The errors are really important in discovering what the text says and how trustworthy the transmission of it was. Later abundant manuscripts that have very early witness in the ancient world provide even greater accuracy. Like I said, if you have an older manuscript and then you've compared it with a very early manuscript and they're the same, then you know that it's just representing that earlier manuscript. Many copies are better than a single original, for the opportunity for alteration in an original is removed with the scriptures delegated to the whole church and not an individual or organization to be inappropriately managed. And what that means is it is better to have an abundant number of manuscripts distributed throughout large geographical areas with errors in them than it is to have one original text that one person or group manages. Because if it's only one person that has them, then the text, first of all, can be altered and nobody would know. Second of all, this is how God took his word and gave it to the whole church. There wasn't just one individual or one group that owned the New Testament. The entire church had it. Now, it required them to get together and make comparisons, compare notes on manuscripts and everything else, but this is how God decided to distribute the truth, because this is different than ancient Israel. In the Old Testament, the priest kept the law and then the prophetic writings, and they kept them together and they managed them in the temple. But as far as the New Testament, the gospel went out to all nations. So which nation is going to control them? This is why the New Testament has such an abundance of copies, and they're distributed through all the known world very early on, and there were just a ton of copies, but they can all be reverse engineered very easily to see what the original text was telling us. So, transmission facts, and this is taken from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, a fact of great security to New Testament accuracy. In AD 303, Roman Emperor Diocletian ordered 3 edicts of persecution upon Christians to destroy churches, manuscripts, and books and people. Estimated thousands of manuscripts were destroyed across the Roman Empire during this persecution, which lasted until 311. So he ended up trying to basically wipe out Christianity until the Edict of Toleration or the Edict of Milan under Constantine. But even if Diocletian had succeeded in wiping out every biblical manuscript off the face of the earth, he could not have destroyed the ability to reconstruct the New Testament. Why? Because the early church fathers, these are men of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and others, quoted the New Testament so much, to be exact, 36,289 times, that all but 11 verses of the New Testament can be reconstructed just from their quotations alone. Now, I think that has changed, and they've discovered that it's not as little as 11 verses, but they can construct over half of the New Testament. Now, what the church fathers would do is quote the New Testament, and it would be no different than if you went and got a whole bunch of different pastors' notes with Bible verses in them on from their sermons, and then made a comparison. You'd be able to reconstruct parts of the New Testament based on what they have for writings. So here's Turek.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hello, my name is Matthew.
Hey, Matthew.
So I'm just curious because you earlier were mentioning something about how we don't necessarily need the Bible to understand morality. Is that correct?
You get more details in the Bible that you wouldn't have if you didn't have it, but basic right and wrong, thou shalt not kill, murder, steal, that we know that intuitively.
Okay. So I guess my question is, so assuming that's true either way, would you agree the Bible is written by men?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's written by men, yeah.
And this is something that I can struggle with, but I study linguistics, and I do a lot of stuff with languages, and to my knowledge, and I think to a lot of biblical scholars, but I can't name it off the top of the head because it's something I just recently was reading, but ancient, it was like some form of like ancient Greek was the original version of language that the New Testament was written in. Is that what you believe as well?
Jesus probably spoke either Aramaic or Hebrew, and it was written in Koine Greek, yes.
Yes, okay. So how do we believe, or how do you believe, rather, it might be a better question, the Bible was written originally? Like, so do you believe, up there it says opponents admitted Gospels written by disciples. Are you saying written, like the Gospels according to Mark were written by Mark, or are you saying that just disciples is in somebody that follows like the teachings of the Bible or something like that?
Who wrote the Gospels is the question? Or
Yeah, just addressing the one point, saying the opponents admitted Gospels written by disciples. So I was just wanting a clarification.
Okay, yes. Well, as far as we know, the writers of the New Testament, there's 8 or 9 writers dependent upon who wrote Hebrews. Most of them bear the name of the person, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, except, the letters of the Apostle Paul, there's about 13 of them. And then there's other letters written by people like Peter, Jude.
So clarification, you believe
James.
Gospels according to Mark was written by Mark?
Yes.
Okay. The same exact disciples like written in the Bible, so Mark in the Bible wrote Gospels according to Mark. Yes?
He wrote the Gospel according to Mark. Okay. That's what the earliest evidence shows, yes.
Well,
now, he was probably getting his information mostly from Peter. That's the thought there.
Well, I would say most of the evidence points to that being completely false, because the people at this time, and Mark, the position that he was in socioeconomically, had no knowledge of Greek at all.
Oh, no, sure they did.
I disagree. I think most historians would disagree with that, and I think most biblical scholars admit that Mark did not write the Gospels according to Mark. You just attest to it.
Wait, are you saying Koine Greek did not exist in the first century?
No. I'm saying that most people spoke Aramaic at that time. Most people also did not speak Hebrew, ancient Hebrew that was mostly attested to religious figures. And as fishermen and as these followers of Jesus, they were not in the church. They were not wealthy. They did not have high socioeconomic standing that is associated with knowing either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek.
Well, what you're doing, though, is you're taking aggregate data, Matthew, and you're applying it to individuals. And you can't do that. You can go the other way.
Sorry, why not?
It would be like saying that...
I mean, we look at statistics, we look at evidence, and we say, to our best of the knowledge, people of his socioeconomic standing did not have the knowledge of this language to be able to write the Gospels according to Mark in point A Hebrew.
What you can't do is, like suppose you say that the average, I'm making something up, the average income in Fairfax, Virginia is $100,000 a year per household. And that's the average. You can say, okay, that's the average, but you can't point at one person in here and say, you're making $100,000. You can't take aggregate data and apply it to individuals, just like you can't take the aggregate of the knowledge of the first century and apply it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, because you don't know if they were a special case.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point, is that we don't know specifically. And so when you don't know specifics, you go by aggregate data because that's what the closest average person is.
But if you have testimony from reliable people that says they did write it, just like if I had testimony from reliable people that said that that man did make $100,000, then I would say or 200 or whatever it was, then I would go with that rather than trying to apply the aggregate data to the individual.
Sure, but where do we see any evidence or statements that are reliable saying that Mark is able to speak and write exquisite point A?
The early church fathers widely attested the gospel writers to the names that we have now, and there is no other data from that time period which suggests any other authors.
Sorry, but the religious figures at that time are very notorious for completely fabricating information or records about religion.
Matthew, you are again taking aggregate data and applying it to individuals.
And I'm saying that because we have no knowledge of these specific people at that time, we have to go by the best possible information.
No, we do have knowledge. We have people writing and attesting about it.
Yeah, you're saying religious figures who, again, are notorious for going back into the period of time that Jesus existed, where the records were contemporaneous.
Matthew, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
What would the writers of the New Testament, what motivation would these people have to invent all this?
I don't claim to know any motivation.
Okay, so then why are you applying nefarious motives to these people that you don't even know?
Are you talking about... No, I'm talking about two separate people. You're saying that we have writings from religious figures who, in the same vein, fabricated evidence, such as... I don't remember the exact guy's name, but there was a really famous... I think it was like Josephus. Josephus was a very famous Roman historian. Josephus. Sorry. Pronunciation's wrong. I wasn't sure the exact pronunciation, but he's very famous for being very... strict in writing about historical figures, especially religious Messiah figures at the time. And it's been pretty accurately debunked that the writing that was in Josephus's work about Jesus existing was completely fabricated by religious figures at the time.
Okay, well, first of all, that's not true.
That is true.
No, Matthew.
I mean, we can disagree, but
okay.
There's one truth. So.
First of all, the only way you can tell if somebody is misquoting something is if you know what the actual quote was, right? So what should Josephus have said rather than... You're talking about the famous passage in Josephus. Now, scholars do agree that Christians altered some of what he said, but we have an Arabic version that appears unaltered. And it still talks about Jesus, and Josephus also talks about Jesus when he talks about the death of Jesus' brother James. But I don't know what that has to do with Mark writing Mark. Let's just say you're right. Let's just say we don't know who wrote the Gospels. So, does that mean that what was written in the Gospels is false?
No, I'm not saying that. I was just saying that it shows that they're... trying to put this in a more elegant situation, but to attest that the writers were there at the time and that these specific biblical figures lends truth, if you believe in that, to the authenticity of the Bible. And I'm just saying that that does not seem to be the case.
Okay.
I'm saying you use that as further proof, once you already believe, of evidence of, oh, look, Mark was there, Mark wrote the Bible, this has to be true, or this is more likely to be true.
Okay, look, yeah, we know documents and sources were written very early. I didn't have time to go through it here.
Yeah.
Even Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic from UNC Chapel Hill, admits Paul writes 1 Corinthians in 55 AD. And an ancient creed that talks about Jesus dying and rising from the dead and everybody that he appeared to comes all the way from the 30s AD. It can't be legendary. That creed is put in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. This is very early stuff. It cannot be legendary. Now the question is, how do you interpret the data, not what is the data? People, atheists, Christians, everyone in between, agree on the data. The question is, how do you interpret it? Do you say Jesus rose from the dead or not? You know, Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic at UNC Chapel Hill, will not take a position on an alternative explanation for the resurrection because he knows that every position he tries to take has holes in it that can't support the weight of the evidence. So the real question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Not who wrote the Gospel of Mark, or whether Mark told everything exactly the way it should have been told. The question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And that's really the issue.
Sure. Kind of a funny thing, but that was leading into my point about morality, was just if the Bible is written by man, and if we don't necessarily know the authenticity or whether or not these people are telling the truth, whether or not they're lying or not, how do we go about understanding better of what is God's morality? Because we have to just make assumptions based off of the Bible, based off of what we believe God has said or God has done, and we interpret that in various ways. So my point was more, it does seem like, sure, if God exists, there's an objective morality, because whatever God commands is objective morality. But my point being is, how do we, as people, understand exactly what that is when God himself did not write the Bible, when it's just other people saying this is the case, and it's other people's interpretations? Because when you write something down, especially when God is saying this or God is saying that, or God commands in certain ways, when people write this down, how do you know they're accurately writing the events, and how do you move from a relative understanding of your own personal interpretation and morality of the Bible to a divine, this is...
All right, let me just ask you a quick question, and then we got a line behind us, so we'll have to go. The quick question is this: do you have any doubt that murder is wrong? That rape is wrong? That theft is wrong?
I mean,
do you have any doubt?
Sorry, we have to define motive. So if motive is just
no. Do you have any doubt that murder is wrong?
Most likely, no.
No, you don't have any doubt, right?
No.
That's my point.
I would specify that there are situations and there's a struggle that personally I believe. But I won't go into this, but it has to do with whether or not my eternal life in heaven is worth other people's lives. And more or less, if I could murder somebody and then that would send me to hell, but it saves hundreds of thousands of other people, should I not feel obligated to do so? And so there's cases, I would say, where...
Well, Jesus volunteered to be murdered for my benefit and for yours. Let's talk later because we're out of time, and I appreciate the question, Matthew.
Tough customer. So, but you see, a lot of these kids, they learn stuff in class, they watch TV, they have their opinions, and unfortunately, I know Frank Turek can't get into huge detail because of there is a lot of people there, but I think if you could actually sit down and teach this kid the actual evidence, that he would see that his positions are all based on assumptions, and he's coming from the perspective that he's assuming what he's trying to prove. He's begging the question. So Frank addressed it with the aggregate data, but basically, if you're just going to assume that everybody that is a religious figure, everything that they wrote is a lie, you'd have to ask the question, well, who wrote that? Well, it's a non-religious person. So now we have to have people that have no sense of a moral obligation to God we need to trust them more than other people. Why would we do that? And what is their motivation? So he just chose to believe one group of people. That's really the issue. So the following slides are going to present a visual representation of the facts that were just mentioned and support for the conclusions that were presented. This is Sir Frederick Kenyon in Our Bible and the Ancient Manuscripts. He said it cannot be too strongly asserted. He was he oversaw at the British Museum years ago all the manuscripts that are there. They have a whole library of New Testament manuscripts. He says it cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain. Especially is this the case with the New Testament. The number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations of it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church, so he's talking about other than Greek and also church fathers that quoted it, is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world. And that is the point that we're moving to. The New Testament stands alone as a historical document representing what it does. Do the New Testaments tell the truth? Let's examine the historicity of the New Testament document. So, hopefully, the transmission aspects of the New Testament are clear at this point. After we finish this particular presentation, I'm going to go into another one that is really more focused on just the Bible itself, not as much as an apologetic as educational, but let's just move on with this. So we're going to go through, and this is taken from Stealing from God by Frank Turek, the 7 E's, evidence for the New Testament. The first E is early testimony. The second is eyewitness testimony. The third is embarrassing testimony. The fourth is excruciating testimony. The fifth is expected testimony. The sixth is extra biblical, that's outside of the Bible testimony. And then finally, elaborate testimony. So we'll go through each of these to demonstrate that the New Testament is telling us the truth. So we know it was transmitted accurately. The question is, what was transmitted? Did it transmit it accurately? So as far as early testimony, the cross was right around 30 AD, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So we have the majority, really, of the New Testament that is written between these two times. So Paul was killed around 65, James just before that, and we know the book of Acts, was written before James, and this is James, the brother of Jesus, not James the apostle, brother of John, who was killed by Herod. That's in the book of Acts. And then we know Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around 55, because the creed that Turek actually referred to in one of the answers that he gave, the creed that is in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, that was actually something Paul received. He said, that which I received, I declared unto you. So this has a rhythm to it. This is something that was established very early, right after the cross. Scholars believe probably 6 months to a year. So we know Luke wrote Acts. So we know that obviously the gospel had to be written before Acts, because Acts was his second volume to Theophilus, and we know that Mark was written before Luke. Paul's epistles And then most of the New Testament before the temple was destroyed because it is not mentioned. It's anticipated by the Gospels, but it's not mentioned in any of the writings. So the age of eyewitnesses is pretty short. And then obviously nothing was added into the New Testament after John died near the end of the first century. And there had to be a living apostle to verify what was put in and established as truth.
Most, if all, the New Testament documents were written prior to 70 AD, and the sources from which the New Testament writers wrote go all the way back to the resurrection itself. Even an atheist like Bart Ehrman, a skeptic, admits that 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 8, which talks about Jesus being resurrected from the dead and who he appeared to, goes all the way back within a year or two of the resurrection itself. This is very early data. Now, Paul wrote it down in 55 AD, but it's very early. In fact, Gary Habermas of Liberty University has identified 41 creeds, like the one in 1 Corinthians 15, which predate the writing of the New Testament. This is very early testimony, very difficult to be invented. Let me ask you a question. Let's suppose you are reading a history of Lower Manhattan, and you read the story of the Twin Towers being built. When the book is over, there's no mention of the towers being destroyed on 9/11. When are you going to assume that book was written? Prior to 9/11, obviously. Well, the New Testament doesn't mention an event that was even more dramatic than 9/11, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. Jesus predicts it in his Olivet Discourse, but nobody ever says, look, Jesus was right. Why not? Because the documents were written prior to 70 AD. In fact, even John, which is thought to have been written late, even John in John chapter 5 talks about a pool of Bethesda was destroyed. The pool of Bethesda was destroyed in 70 AD, yet John is speaking of it as if it's still standing when he's writing. Even the book of Revelation indicates it seems that the temple is still standing. There is positive evidence that the New Testament writers are likely writing prior to 70 AD.
All right, so that was kind of an update on what we had been going through, and the thing that I would like to add to all of this is a lot of times skeptics or people that are quite frankly pretty ignorant, they say, well, there was a lot of stuff that was removed out of documents after they were written, so they're not accurate and everything else. That's impossible. You cannot go back into history and grab all the New Testament documents, some of them written on very, very flimsy stuff and everything else, but you can't go back in and just erase stuff and take it out. You know, people make these outlandish claims. Unfortunately, a lot of ignorant professors in colleges, and sometimes you see on these programs on television where they say, well, you know, it looks like people have, the church went back and changed everything that was written in the New Testament to make it say what they want it to say now. That's impossible. You cannot go back and change all those documents, not only because of the mere quantity of them, but you would have to not only get every document, but how would you change it? What would you do when you erased pieces of it? There would be gaps, there would be holes, there would be you'd have to destroy them in order to change them. This isn't a computer that you can just delete a line of writing or alter it. You're talking about handwritten copies. I mean, God was so wise the way he did this, because he constructed the New Testament in a time where you did not have computers or anything close to it. You didn't have anything other than very slow manual copies being made, and the attention of the people doing it was in such a way that they were skilled at it. It's not like today, and so we don't want to read back into the first century things of the 21st century. So let's look at a quick chronology of Paul's letters, where Frank was talking about the dating of his letters. So Galatians is assumed to be written around 49 AD. It's pretty much assumed that Galatians was the earliest, and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians average around 51, probably anywhere between 50 and 52. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 55, 56. Romans, then when Paul was in jail in Rome, he wrote the prison epistles, and then 1 Timothy and Titus, and his last letter was 2 Timothy. So when we look at the reliability of documents, notice that the New Testament, when this chart was put together by Norm Geisler, there was 5,686 New Testament documents, and the earliest one was 25 years from its original writing. The next closest was Homer, and then notice as they go down that the quantity of documents from these historical figures is just a few. And though they found more of Homer's and all that, the point is that the New Testament is really in its own category. I mean, look at Plato. We have 7 documents from Plato, and the earliest one is 1,200 years from the original writing. So we can only assume that what he wrote is represented in that, but how do you know? I mean, there's just not enough documents to actually know. They make the assumption, but you see the difference when you compare them like this.
I was debating a well-known skeptic about 2 years ago. And this fellow had his say. He was having his talk up on the stage. And he said, the Gospels are lousy sources for the life of Jesus. Lousy sources. They're too late. And I got up there, and it was my turn to respond, and I said, do you think we know a lot about Alexander the Great? And he said, oh yeah, we know a lot about Alexander. I said, really? Yeah, we know a lot about Alexander. So when are the first biographies of Alexander written? He said, I don't know. So I'll tell you when the first biographies of Alexander the Great were written. This is ground zero for Alexander the Great. He dies about 330 BC. And the first major source, I'm not talking about an inscription here and a one-liner here. The first major source that might be something like one of our Gospels for Alexander goes like this. It's a Spire exit. I think I better not go out this door. One time I went out this door during a lecture, and the door locked. I had to knock on the door to get back in. The earliest source for Alexander, plus 350. John's way too late at 65. Plus 350. And so I said that. And I said the best sources for Alexander are Arrian and Plutarch. Plus 4.25 to plus 450. And the guy said, yeah, but the Gospels record miracles. I said, oh, does that do them in for you? He said, yes, it does. I said, well, then once again, I wonder if you've read Greco-Roman history. Because almost no Greco-Roman historian, Thucydides is one of the only exceptions, Almost no Greco-Roman historian writes, not even Herodotus, writes without recording the supernatural, miracles, prophecies, all kinds of things. And of course, we can know a lot about Alexander, right? Here's how Plutarch's Alexander begins. It's commonly believed that Alexander was the son of Jupiter and his mother was a virgin. Well, but Alexander's a great source.
You know, if you go to, you can just Google Gary Habermas, but if you go to his website, he's got a ton of information on there. Really recommend him if you want to dig into any of this, and I think you'd really enjoy it if that's what you're interested in. But he probably has cataloged more documentary evidence on the resurrection than anybody, period. So he's obviously a historical expert. He's an expert in manuscripts and the New Testament, and he's over at Liberty. I think he still teaches there, Liberty University, but just a great source for information. And he has a number of books that are all, I don't know that he wrote a bad one. So again, highly recommend him. So the testimony of the scrolls, right? In the New Testament, we have more New Testament manuscripts than anything else. And here's the comparison. If we average it at 5,700, most other books have 10 to 20, and we're talking thousands for the New Testament, all right? Now, we have about 8,000 Latin Vulgates. So now if you were to follow the transmission lines, you would see that Greek manuscripts continued to be copied all the way up, 1,000 years after, okay, to the 10th century. And you have Latin that entered in around the 3rd century. So you have a parallel now running. You have both Greek and Latin. They're taking the Greek, they're copying over it to the Latin, and the Latin Vulgates, that just means the common Latin language. That change also provides information on what the Latin fathers believed were the better manuscripts based on how they copied over and how they spelled certain words. So all this is hugely instructive. Okay, now if you get to Coptic, Syriac, unfortunately a lot of the stuff in Syria was destroyed by ISIS a few years back, but they had just invaluable documents that were ruined and destroyed by them. But Armenian, Nubian, now you have 9,300 early versions that again will parallel Greek writings. So if you have 5,800 original language manuscripts, now you're up to 24,000 copies to compare. Now they've found many more Greek manuscripts, and we'll get into that as we get further on in the presentation. But they just haven't all been cataloged. They're actually being put online digitally. That's a whole nother thing, and we'll get into that. But this is the sheer volume here, the ability to compare. So, that's why I laugh when people say, well, the church went back in and changed all the documents. Sure, it went and found 24,000 copies and altered them all. I mean, it's just an absurdity, right? And what they do, they erased the parchment. What they do, write it in Bic? I mean, come on. So there are earlier New Testament documents, right, than most other books. We're talking about 25 to 150 year gap in the copies, okay, from the originals. the earliest in any other book is 1,000 years. So these are comparisons, and the 7Q5 is around probably a fragment from Mark that is around 50 AD. So that's the Magdalene Papyri, about 70 AD. It's also referred to as the Jesus Papyri. The John Ryland fragment, 5 verses from John 18. We'll see it on the next slide. These are some very, very early ones. Now, they have found earlier ones. This is the Bodmer Papyri, about 200 AD, most of John. Now, not every Greek manuscript has the whole New Testament. Sometimes you just have a gospel or the Gospels. Sometimes you just have like Paul's letters or a couple of letters or one letter, and sometimes you have a fragment of one of the books. So I don't want to give the impression that there's 5,800 full New Testament copies. That's not the case. The Chester Beatty Papyri, obviously nearly all the New Testament books, but these are named typically after the people that discovered them or the location. And then the Vaticanus manuscript around 325 to 350, which has most of the Old and New Testament in it. So this is an example here. This is the John Rylands fragment. And this is from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It says it was found in Egypt across the Mediterranean from its probable place of composition in Asia Minor, demonstrating that John's Gospel was copied and had spread quite some distance by the early 2nd century. Even earlier than the John Rylands fragment are 9 disputed fragments that date from AD 50 to 70 found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls really unearthed some hugely valuable copies that substantiated so much of the Bible. But anyways, this is just one example. This is Daniel Wallace.
Every single manuscript in the world is written on perishable materials. It's a difficult situation, but once you open a manuscript, now you're making that ink susceptible to deterioration far worse than if you just kept it closed. But if you kept it closed, you can't see what it is. Manuscripts are in danger of deterioration, of theft, and of intentional damage. What CSNTM is actually doing is preserving these manuscripts digitally, which also preserves them physically. I started CSNTM so we could get digital images of Greek New Testament manuscripts that were high quality, available on the internet, so they could be accessed by anyone, anywhere in the world. When we think about these manuscripts, it's not just for students of Greek. Their importance is exponential. We get these manuscripts to connect us back to the time of Jesus and the apostles. Then they get converted into printed texts. There are critical Greek New Testaments that are based on what scholars believe are the very best readings in these manuscripts. Those Greek New Testaments that are published nowadays are what are used by all translators. Our work is helping these translations. These translations are then used by missionaries, by pastors, by teachers of the Bible, by ordinary Christians who want to find out who Jesus is and what the apostles taught about him. Since 2002, CSNTM has digitized more Greek New Testament manuscripts than any other institute in the world. And in the process, we have also discovered more than any other institute. It's difficult to study the manuscript unless someone has access either to the manuscript or to the images. Having them online makes a world of difference. Anywhere in the world where you've got internet connection, you can access CSNTM's images. Our search engine is so flexible, you can type in John 3:16 and it will populate with every single manuscript that has John 3:16 in it, and it'll show just that page so you can find the very verse you're looking for. This has been kind of a world changer for people to actually have access to these handwritten manuscripts, but then making these images and all of our work completely available to everybody for free for all time. we protect these manuscripts at all costs. When we digitize these manuscripts, we work with the libraries and they retain the copyright, and we protect their rights by not letting these manuscript images be downloaded. The mission statement of CSNTM essentially has two parts. First, to get every single Greek New Testament manuscript digitized and made available. Our ultimate mission is also collaborative, where we work with other institutes and scholars in studying these manuscripts to try to recover the wording of the original text as much as is humanly possible. Our task is urgent and it's significant. Sometime back when we photographed the manuscripts at the National Library of Greece, I came across a colophon, a statement by the scribe at the end of the manuscript. And in a sense, this has become the motto for CSNTM as well. And at the end of this manuscript, which is now over 1,000 years old, he said, "The hand that wrote this is rotting in the grave, but the words that are written will last until the fullness of times." That's the goal that CSNTM has as well.
So Daniel Wallace, and we'll have to kind of cut it there, but I wanted to give you that introduction. Daniel Wallace is heading up that ministry for years, starting in 2002, and he is probably the living expert. I mean, there's a lot of New Testament experts, but he is probably, the leader of the pack as far as living experts today. And he used to, I think he still does, teach at Dallas Seminary, but he is definitely on the top of all of this. And we'll hear more from him, and we'll get more into the manuscripts, but I just wanted to kind of wet your whistle on that. So anyways, hopefully this was instructive. We went a little bit over an hour. I apologize for the length, but let's pray. Lord, we do thank you that you have just given your whole word to the whole church. And we thank you, Lord, throughout the centuries, you did it your way. And we can look back and see the wisdom of how and why you did it the way that you did do it. We thank you for bringing your word to us through the sacrifice of so many. And we ask for your blessing on the time that we spent here in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys.